That Willys is junk, old-timer." The words cut through the garage like a hammer striking metal. Henry Calloway didn't flinch. He leaned lightly against the faded olive-green Jeep, letting the accusation hang in the air. Around him, young mechanics smirked and nudged each other, their confidence bolstered by the mockery of age, the certainty that modern tools had rendered the old obsolete. The Willys, parked in the corner, had seen more storms, mud, fire, and fear than any of them would ever witness in a lifetime. And yet, in their eyes, it was nothing more than scrap. Henry's hands rested on the hood, worn and scarred from decades of labor. His palms smelled faintly of motor oil and earth, the lingering memory of years spent keeping machines alive that no one else could fix. He could feel the vibration of the garage floor beneath his boots, a dull pulse that reminded him of something far older, far deeper. It was not the pulse of modern engines. It was the pulse of memory. "You don't understand," he finally said, his voice calm, deliberate. "She's seen things that would make your fancy engine shiver." The young mechanic, barely past 25, snorted and ran his greasy fingers through his hair. "I understand perfectly," he said. "This thing is useless. Just a relic for old men to cling to." Silence hung heavy. A few older mechanics exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen Henry before, knew the quiet dignity in his posture, the precision in his movements. But this young man didn't know Henry Calloway, nor did he know the story written into every dent and scratch on the Willys. Henry closed his eyes for a moment. He could feel the Willys beneath his hands like a heartbeat. Each scar, each chip of paint told a story, a patrol in the rain-soaked forests of Europe, a night when shrapnel flew too close, a comrade who had never come home. And though his body had aged, though his hands now shook slightly when held in stillness, the spirit inside him had never weakened. The garage air smelled of burnt rubber, oil, and the faint tang of metal, but beneath that, Henry could smell something else: memory. Fear, adrenaline, grief, relief. The Willys had carried him through jungles and deserts alike, through nights where the stars were the only witnesses to the horrors that had unfolded. The young mechanic moved closer, eager to assert dominance, unaware that every step he took was a step into a history he could not comprehend. He tapped the hood with a gloved hand. "Come on, old man. Let's see if she even starts." Henry's lips pressed together. He didn't respond. Silence had always been his weapon. Silence had carried him when guns couldn't, when words were useless, when a wrong move could mean death. He had learned long ago that power did not need noise to exist. And right now, he needed nothing more than patience. He reached up and touched a small dent along the driver's side door, running his thumb along the metal. That dent had saved him once. A bullet had glanced off that very spot. Another had pierced the canvas roof but left him unharmed. And he remembered Elliot, laughing too loud, reckless, sitting shotgun with a grin he would never see again. The memory of his friend tightened Henry's chest and made the air in the garage feel suddenly thick. The young mechanic crouched beside the Jeep's engine bay, eyeing the carburetor and choke, muttering words Henry didn't fully hear. He had a sense of triumph already. Henry could see it in the bright, overconfident eyes, the tension in the jaw, the eagerness to humiliate. And yet, Henry felt nothing but calm. Because he remembered. He remembered long nights in mud up to his knees, hands numb, stomach empty, and the only thing that kept him alive was focus. And he remembered the roar of the Willys engine, as it pushed forward when everything else had failed. He remembered the way it carried him and his unit through chaos. The way it responded to him as if it understood that survival was not optional. The young mechanic tried to crank the engine. The Willys coughed once, then died. Laughter erupted. It was cruel, easy, the kind of laughter born from certainty and ignorance. "See," the young man said. "Dead, I told you. Junk." Henry didn't move. He didn't respond. He simply let the engine sputter and the laughter fade into tension. There was a stillness in him, a quiet strength that the young mechanic could not see. And in that stillness, a storm was gathering. He could almost hear the echoes of gunfire, the shouts of men he had carried home, the whispers of those lost in the fog of war. All of it converged in a single, silent promise: history has a way of proving itself, often when the world is too blind to notice. And as the garage continued to buzz with disbelief, Henry reached for the ignition. His hands, though trembling slightly, moved with precision born of decades. He adjusted the choke, waited, and breathed slowly. The Willys groaned, coughed, and then roared to life, filling the garage with a sound raw and unyielding, as if it had been waiting all along for the world to challenge it once more. The laughter died instantly. The young mechanic froze, disbelief painted across his face. Others turned, eyes wide. Some stepped back, suddenly aware that this was more than an old car. This was a testament. Henry didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply sat, hands steady on the wheel, eyes distant, listening to the engine that had carried him through life's most violent and sorrowful storms. The power of the moment wasn't in his voice, but in his silence. And the young mechanic understood, without a word spoken, that some things, some people, carry strength that no age, no mockery, and no time can diminish. Henry finally spoke, quiet but firm. She's not junk. She's history. She's survival. And she remembers every day that she helped us live when nothing else would. The young mechanic swallowed hard. Words failed him. Pride faltered. And for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of respect, not demanded, but earned. Henry exhaled slowly, his gaze softening as he placed a hand gently on the hood. Somewhere deep inside, the memories of loss and grief, of comrades, of nights spent in fear, mingled with a quiet joy. The Willys was still alive, still fighting, still proving the impossible possible. And in that moment, silence spoke louder than any voice, louder than laughter, louder than doubt. Henry let the Willys idle, its engine thrumming a steady heartbeat beneath him. The young mechanic had backed away, hands still trembling, as if afraid the Jeep itself might bite. But Henry wasn't afraid, not of mocking words, not of disbelief, not even of his own mortality. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the memories come, unbidden, unfiltered, as vivid as if they were happening now. He was 19 again. The world was cold, wet, and unforgiving. Boots soaked through with mud, stomach hollow with hunger, hands frozen around a rifle that felt heavier than the years to come. The Willys had been new then, just delivered to their unit in the middle of a forest whose trees loomed like silent sentinels over a war that had no mercy. Henry remembered the smell first. Diesel mixed with wet pine, gunpowder, blood, and fear. Every breath was a reminder of what hung in the balance. They moved through that forest like shadows, dodging snipers, mines, and shellfire, each patrol a test of endurance, nerve, and luck. And the Willys, it carried them, steadfast, over terrain that should have ripped its axles from its frame, through nights where visibility was measured in heartbeats and whispers, and through mornings where the bodies of friends became lessons in how fragile life could be. Elliot had been with him, of course. Elliot, whose laugh could pierce the dark like sunlight through clouds, whose hands never shook even in the worst of storms. They had driven side by side, joking quietly as the Willys groaned over rocks and through mud, the engine complaining but never surrendering. It was the only companion that had never faltered, the only thing that had remained loyal when everything else, everything human, could and would fail. Then came the night that Henry could never forget. The ambush had been sudden, brutal, and precise. Mortars screamed overhead, sending showers of dirt and debris onto the Jeep. Bullets riddled the canvas top, one catching Elliot in a moment too fast to process. Henry's hands moved instinctively. He swerved, pushed the engine beyond reason, prayed silently for survival. When the dust settled, Elliot did not move. The Willys had survived. Henry had survived. But part of him, the part that had laughed, dreamed, and trusted, had not. Decades later, Henry still felt the ghost of that night. Every dent, every scar on the Willys was a reminder survival is not guaranteed. And some memories never fade, no matter how deeply you bury them beneath ordinary life. He had returned home, the war behind him, but the weight of loss always ahead. Friends buried, comrades forgotten by the world, a wife who had aged too quickly beside him, children who had grown and left. He had driven the Willys across towns that had no idea of its history, towns that treated him as an old man clinging to a relic. And now, here it was again, in a garage full of young men who believed knowledge alone could grant superiority. They didn't see the life carved into every bolt. They didn't see the nights the Willys had pushed through, bleeding, screaming, and yet surviving. And they certainly didn't see the quiet resolve in Henry's eyes, a resolve born not of arrogance, but of experience, grief, and survival. The young mechanic shifted, finally breaking the silence. "How old are you?" he asked, not unkindly, but with curiosity creeping through disbelief. "How long have you been driving that thing?" Henry opened his eyes. Pale blue, steady, and piercing. long enough to know that machines remember, long enough to know what it means to carry people through hell, long enough to understand that some things are not measured in horsepower or modern parts. The words seemed to hang in the air, awkwardly heavy. No one in the garage had ever heard Henry speak like this. The silence that followed wasn't awkward this time, it was reverent. Respect, unspoken and deep, started to weave its way through the room. The young mechanic leaned against the lift again, but something had shifted in him. The smugness was gone. Curiosity replaced it, and for a moment, Henry allowed himself a small, private smile. Not at the mechanic, no, not yet, but at the Willys itself, that steadfast companion that had carried him through decades of sorrow and fleeting joy. Henry remembered another memory then, lighter, warmer. A quiet night in a foreign village after a patrol had gone wrong. Fires from distant homes illuminated faces of children who didn't speak their language but smiled anyway. He had shared chocolate from his ration pack, laughed silently with Elliot at the absurdity of life continuing in the middle of chaos. Those small, human moments had survived the war along with the Willys, tucked safely into his heart. Now, decades later, he could feel the echoes of that night in the garage, a lesson: resilience, courage, and quiet strength are not measured by what people see, but by what they survive and carry forward. The Willys sputtered slightly, reminding him it was alive. He ran his hand over the dashboard. Each scratch, each faded mark was a story, a scar that told him he had endured, that he had honored those lost, and that he had never truly failed. The young mechanic finally asked the question Henry had been waiting for. Did it really carry people through war? Henry's gaze softened, distant now, yet filled with the weight of decades. Yes, he said, almost to himself. It carried people and memories and ghosts. Some of us came back, some of us didn't. But this always remembered. And it taught me that survival isn't about speed or strength. It's about endurance, care, and respect. The young mechanic swallowed. His hands no longer fidgeted. Something inside him had shifted, a flicker of understanding, a sense that respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. And this old man, quiet, steadfast, had earned it through fire, loss, and time. Henry finally started the Willys again, letting it purr steadily beneath him. The sound was no longer just mechanical. It was living memory. A voice that spoke of loss and courage, sorrow and fleeting happiness, of anger at injustice, and the calm that follows endurance. In that moment, the garage didn't feel like a place of mocking anymore. It was a cathedral. And Henry, sitting quietly behind the wheel, was its silent priest, guiding the young men around him to a lesson they could not yet fully comprehend. The young mechanic whispered, almost to himself, I didn't understand. Henry nodded. That was enough. Understanding would grow with time, with observation, with patience. The same qualities that had carried him and the Willys through every impossible moment in their long, intertwined lives. And outside, the sun was starting to pierce through the grimy garage windows, casting streaks of light that glinted off the olive paint. It caught the scars and the dents. It caught the story. And in that light, even the young mechanic had to admit, some things simply could not be broken. The garage smelled of oil, hot metal, and dust. The Willys purred beneath Henry's hands like a living heartbeat, steady and enduring. Outside, sunlight pierced through grimy windows, catching the faded green paint in streaks that told 1,000 stories. Inside, the young mechanic stood frozen, hands at his sides, a flush of frustration mingled with awe creeping up his neck. He had expected a machine, nothing more, and instead, he faced a living testament. Henry ran his fingers across the steering wheel, the leather worn smooth by decades of hands just like his. Each scratch was a memory. Each dent a scar from battles fought and survived. He could feel the weight of those moments pressing down again. The nights when fear was as close as the cold metal of a rifle, when he had carried comrades whose laughter now only echoed in his mind, when he had driven this Jeep across mud and fire, across death and despair, carrying the fragile human flame of hope. The young mechanic finally broke the silence. You really went through all of that?" His voice was quieter now, tinged with disbelief, tinged with guilt. He had come into the garage armed with arrogance, expecting to dominate, to mock. Instead, he had stumbled into a story far larger than himself. Henry nodded slowly. "I did. And this Jeep, she carried more than I did. She carried my friends. She carried men who never came home. And every time she moved forward, I moved forward too. A pause stretched in the air, thick with understanding and regret. The young mechanic's eyes darted to the Willys again, lingering on the chipped paint. The canvas top sagging, the small dent at the driver's side door that had once saved a life. He could almost see the ghost of the past moving across the metal, feel their quiet presence. You mean she's alive?" he whispered. Henry's lips curved faintly. "Alive, she's always been alive. Not in the way you're shiny. New engines are alive, but in a way that counts. Alive with memory. Alive with the weight of what she carried." The young mechanic swallowed hard. For the first time, he felt the surge of shame that accompanies arrogance stripped away. He had mocked, laughed, and thought himself clever. Now he realized that some lessons could not be learned from books or videos, nor through force or pride. They had to be experienced, felt, and in this quiet garage, beneath the hum of an old engine, and the gaze of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and survived, he was beginning to understand what it meant. Henry glanced around the room. The older mechanics, who had been watching from the sidelines, nodded subtly to each other. They had known, always, that Henry's silence held more power than words. The young men would learn that lesson today, one way or another. The young mechanic's fists clenched. He felt anger bubbling, at himself for misunderstanding, at the world for moving so quickly that it forgot the past, at the arrogance that had filled his own youth. But beneath the anger, there was also sorrow, a tender, raw sorrow that made his chest tighten. Sorrow for what he had ignored, for what he had dismissed as unimportant, for the sacrifices made by men like Henry that he had never even considered. Henry noticed the change. He could sense it in the slight tremor of the mechanic's hands, in the way his eyes softened as they returned to the Jeep. He did not speak immediately. Silence was his ally. The Willys hummed softly, as if aware that the young man was at the edge of understanding. And then Henry spoke, his voice low but commanding. "Do you see now?" The young mechanic's voice faltered. "Oh, I think I do. But it's hard. I never imagined." His words trailed off. Henry nodded. "I know. Most people can't imagine what it's like to survive, when everything seems against you, when the world wants to write you off, when even friends are lost along the way. But the Willys remembers. And so do I. And we're still here." A sense of awe began to settle over the garage. The young mechanic's chest ached, not from exhaustion, but from the sudden, heavy weight of respect. He realized that the Willys was not just a Jeep. It was a chronicle, a witness, a survivor. And Henry Calloway was its steward, a living proof that endurance, patience, and quiet strength were sometimes louder than any shout or boast. He stepped closer almost unconsciously, as if drawn by a force beyond logic. He reached out, tentatively, to touch the hood. It was warm from the engine, vibrating softly under his fingertips. The sensation was unlike anything he had felt before. A connection not just to metal, but to history, to lives lived and lost, to lessons carved in scarred leather and dented steel. Henry watched him, eyes calm, and remembered a different young man, not so long ago, with his own doubts and arrogance, entering a world far bigger than himself. He remembered the moments when guidance had been needed but unspoken, when lessons were learned in silence, in observation, in respect. The young mechanic's voice was barely audible. "I am sorry." Henry's nod was subtle but full of meaning. Apologies were not required. Understanding was enough. Respect would grow, seated in this quiet moment, nurtured over time. The anger and mockery that had filled the room earlier evaporated, replaced by a fragile, tentative admiration. Then Henry started the engine again. The Willys roared, but this time not as a challenge, not as a declaration of dominance. It roared as a celebration, a testament, a reminder that life could endure, that memory could live, that quiet strength could command attention without ever raising its voice. The young mechanic stepped back, taking a deep breath. He could feel the tears prickling at the corners of his eyes, not just from awe, but from sorrow, regret, and a profound sense of humility. He understood, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to carry responsibility, to honor the past, to respect those who had survived when others had not. Henry reached over and patted the hood gently. "She'll teach you if you're willing to learn. Not everything is obvious. Not everything is loud. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the heaviest truths." The garage seemed to hold its breath. Even the air felt denser, charged with a moral weight that could not be ignored. The young mechanic exhaled slowly, letting the realization sink in, feeling the mixture of anger, sorrow, respect, and wonder swirl inside him, and somewhere deep in his chest, a spark of happiness began to glow. Happiness not born of victory, but of understanding, of witnessing a truth far greater than himself, of recognizing that some battles are fought in silence, and some victories are earned not with pride, but with patience, endurance, and respect. Henry knew the turning point had arrived. The young mechanic was no longer a mocker. He was a student, standing on the edge of comprehension, ready to grasp a fraction of the weight that Henry had carried for decades. And that, Henry realized, was enough. The Willys continued to hum, its engine steady, alive and aware. It had survived war, loss, mockery, and disbelief. And now, in this small garage filled with the smell of oil and dust, it was teaching a lesson that no manual could ever convey. The young mechanic finally spoke, voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you for showing me. I didn't realize." Henry smiled faintly, his eyes distant, still remembering the ghosts, the laughter, the fear, the sorrow, and the joy. "Most people don't," he said softly. "But the world has a way of teaching those who are willing to listen." And in that garage, amid the lingering smell of oil and grease, amid the hum of an old engine and the weight of countless memories, a silent transformation occurred. The lesson was learned, not through force, not through argument, but through experience, presence, and the quiet endurance of a man and his machine. The garage was still. Even the clattering of tools seemed to pause, as if the air itself had recognized a shift. The young mechanic stood a few feet from the Willys, his hands dangling at his sides, uncertainty and awe swirling together like a storm inside him. He had come here to dominate, to prove his knowledge, to mock the relics of a past he barely understood. Instead, he had been humbled, confronted by a story that lived and breathed through a machine and the man beside it. Henry sat behind the wheel, quiet, steady, eyes distant but unyielding. There was no triumph in his posture, no pride flashing outward. His strength was quiet, unassuming, rooted in decades of survival and loss. And yet, it radiated outward in a way that was undeniable. "You've learned something today," Henry said, voice calm, carrying weight far greater than any shout. "Not about engines, not about mechanics, but about respect, about endurance, about understanding what it means to survive." The young mechanic's chest tightened. He could feel the words in his bones. They resonated with the memories he had never lived but could almost see in the dents, the scratches, the faded green paint of the Willys. His arrogance had crumbled, replaced by a deep, almost painful awareness of history, sacrifice, and silent strength. Henry shifted slightly, running his hand over the hood again, feeling the vibrations of the engine beneath his fingertips. It was a living thing, a companion that had carried men through unimaginable fear, through grief, and through the tenuous thread of hope that had kept them alive. And now, in this small, dusty garage, it was carrying the young mechanic toward a realization that would shape him forever. I understand now," the young man whispered, voice low, tinged with sorrow and awe. I didn't see it before." Henry nodded, eyes softening. He could sense the sincerity, feel the shift in energy. Respect does not always announce itself. It grows quietly, slowly, until one day it cannot be ignored. That day had arrived. Outside the garage, sunlight poured in, cutting across the floor in golden streaks. Dust motes danced in the beams, catching the light like fragments of memory suspended in time. Henry looked at the Willys, feeling the weight of decades press lightly on his shoulders, the weight of lives saved, of friends lost, of battles fought and endured. And in that weight, he found peace. The young mechanic stepped closer, hesitating for a moment before touching the hood. His fingers lingered over the faded paint, tracing the outline of a dent that had once stopped a bullet. The contact was reverent, almost trembling. He could feel the vibration of the engine beneath his fingertips, the pulse of history coursing through metal and memory. I'm sorry," he murmured, for mocking you. I didn't understand. I didn't know." Henry's nod was subtle but full of meaning. Forgiveness was unnecessary. Understanding, acknowledgement, and respect were the gifts he could offer. And he offered them freely, without fanfare, without expectation. The garage seemed to hold its breath as the young mechanic absorbed the moment. The other men, older and younger alike, watched in silence. Some whispered quietly, sharing glances of awe. The mockery that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by a reverent quiet that honored what had survived decades, what had endured fire, grief, and doubt. Henry leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. Memories washed over him, the war, the friends lost, the nights spent in fear. The quiet moments of laughter and fleeting joy. The Willys had been there through it all, unflinching, loyal, and steadfast. And now, in the stillness of the garage, it was once again proving its worth, not through loud demonstration, but through enduring presence. The young mechanic stepped back, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He had never experienced anything like this before. The combination of anger, sorrow, respect, and emerging happiness felt almost overwhelming. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that strength and courage are not always loud, not always visible, but often quiet, persistent, and enduring. Henry finally spoke softly, with the kind of authority that cannot be ignored. She's not just a Jeep. She's history. She's survival. And she's a lesson if you're willing to learn it. The young mechanic nodded, words failing him. His pride had been dismantled, replaced by something far more powerful: humility, reverence, and an understanding that some battles are fought not with engines or tools, but with endurance, memory, and quiet, unwavering resolve. The Willys, sensing the change, seemed to hum even more steadily, vibrating beneath Henry's hands with the energy of decades of survival. It was as if it, too, recognized the transformation taking place, the lesson being passed silently from one generation to the next. Henry started the Jeep again. The engine roared, steady, raw, alive. Not aggressive, not boastful, but powerful in its calm endurance. The sound filled the garage, reverberating against the walls, echoing through the hearts of those who listened. It was a sound that carried history, sorrow, laughter, and triumph all at once. The young mechanic stepped back again, swallowing hard. He could feel the emotion in his chest, a mixture of sorrow for the lives lost, respect for the endurance displayed, and an almost overwhelming happiness for having witnessed the quiet power of survival and legacy. "You'll never forget this, will you?" Henry asked, voice soft but firm. The young man shook his head. "No, never." Henry smiled faintly, a small curve that held decades of experience, grief, love, and resilience. "Good. Remember it. Carry it with you. Let it guide you. And when the world mocks, when it doubts, when it dismisses, let your strength be silent, but undeniable." The garage seemed to exhale collectively. Even the tools seemed to settle into a quiet rhythm. The lesson had been delivered, not with confrontation or anger, but with presence, patience, and quiet dignity. And the young mechanic, standing there with newfound reverence, understood that this was a moment that would stay with him for a lifetime. Henry shut off the engine, letting the Jeep settle into stillness once again. The vibration ceased, leaving only the residual hum of memories and endurance in the air. He stepped out, boots scuffing lightly on the concrete floor. The young mechanic followed him, words still unspoken, emotions raw and overwhelming. Henry placed a hand gently on the hood one last time. "She remembers everything," he said, "and so should you." The young mechanic nodded, feeling tears welling in his eyes. It was a moment of reconciliation, understanding, and transformation. He had mocked, doubted, and disrespected. Now he understood, deeply and profoundly, that history, endurance, and quiet strength demand respect, and that sometimes the loudest victories are silent, invisible to those who are unwilling to see. And for the first time, the young man felt a spark of hope, a flicker of admiration, and the undeniable warmth of human connection. He had been humbled, but not broken. He had been enlightened, but not defeated. And in that quiet garage, among the hum of metal and memory, a lesson had been passed down that would endure far longer than any engine, any tool, or any fleeting pride. The Willys sat in the garage, quiet now. Its engine cooled, but its presence still commanding. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, tracing the faded olive paint and illuminating every dent, scratch, and imperfection. Each mark was a testament to survival, endurance, and a life lived fully, recklessly, painfully, beautifully. Henry Calloway rested a hand on the hood, feeling the vibrations of memory resonate through his fingers, as if the Jeep itself could share the stories it carried. The young mechanic stood beside him, hands clasped in front of him, still trembling slightly. He had learned more than he had ever imagined possible in the last hour. He had come to mock to prove superiority, to assert knowledge. He had left humbled, moved, and irrevocably changed. Anger, frustration, and arrogance had melted into sorrow, respect, and a fragile, profound joy. Henry looked at him with a calm intensity. "Remember this feeling," he said quietly. Not the embarrassment, not the guilt. Remember the respect. Remember the understanding that life doesn't hand out victories to the loudest voice. Sometimes it rewards patience, endurance, and quiet resolve. The young mechanic nodded, tears welling in his eyes. He could feel the weight of all the stories, the fear, the loss, the grief, and the fleeting happiness, pouring into him like a river, unstoppable and cleansing. He had seen what it meant to carry responsibility beyond words. He had felt what it meant to survive, not just physically, but morally and emotionally. Henry ran a hand over the Willys hood one last time. Memories of war surged, the forest roads slick with mud, the night ambushes, the cries of friends lost and saved. He remembered Elliot's laugh, still echoing faintly in his mind. And the faces of men he had carried home in the back of the Jeep, the weight of them pressing into his soul. Each memory was a scar and a blessing, pain and pride intertwined. The garage was silent except for the hum of distant machinery and the soft sound of their breathing. The other mechanics had watched quietly, witnessing transformation unfold before them. They had been bystanders to a lesson too deep and too meaningful for words. One delivered in patience, endurance, and presence rather than in argument or confrontation. Henry finally spoke, voice soft but filled with unwavering authority. She's not just a Jeep, she's proof. Proof that survival isn't always loud. Proof that quiet strength often carries more weight than arrogance. And proof that respect, real respect, is earned, not demanded. The young mechanic's voice broke. I understand now. I see it, the history, the sacrifices, the lives you've carried. His chest ached with the complexity of emotion, sorrow for those lost, anger for his own ignorance, happiness for the lesson learned, and awe for the enduring strength of Henry and the Willys. Henry smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held decades of endurance and sorrow, of loss and survival. Good, he said. Let it guide you. Let it teach you patience, humility, and courage. And remember, the world doesn't always notice those who endure quietly. But those who endure, they change everything around them without even trying. The young mechanic swallowed hard. He could feel a subtle pride now, not in himself, but in understanding. He could feel the stirrings of empathy, of compassion, and the recognition that life's true victories are often invisible, carried in silence, in resilience, and in respect. Henry climbed out of the Jeep, boots scuffing softly against the concrete floor. He ran a hand over the hood one last time, feeling the warmth, the vibrations, the life inside it. The Jeep had survived war, fire, loss, mockery, and disbelief, and in this quiet garage, it had proven once again its enduring legacy. The young mechanic stepped forward and placed a hand lightly on the hood beside Henry's. Thank you, he whispered, for showing me, for teaching me. Henry nodded. No words could add more. Silence carried more weight than any speech. And the garage, filled with the hum of memory and the presence of living history, seemed to exhale collectively, acknowledging the passage of a lesson, one that would endure far beyond the walls of the building, far beyond the fleeting moments of pride or arrogance. Outside, sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the Willys in a golden glow. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams of light, resembling fragments of memory suspended in time. The Jeep gleamed softly, a relic made alive by history, endurance, and quiet dignity. Henry finally stepped back, looking at the young mechanic, the garage, the Willys, and the empty streets beyond the windows. He thought of all the nights he had survived, all the friends he had lost, all the lessons carried silently through decades. And he felt something he rarely allowed himself: quiet contentment. The world had finally, if fleetingly, recognized what had always existed. Strength, courage, and endurance need not be loud to be monumental. The young mechanic inhaled deeply, a mixture of awe, sorrow, and happiness washing over him. He felt small, humbled, but alive in a new way. He had glimpsed the weight of true survival, the cost of endurance, and the beauty of quiet, unyielding strength. And he would carry it forward, a spark of understanding ignited in his chest. Henry placed his hand gently on the Jeep's hood and whispered, almost to himself, "She remembers everything, and so should we." The young mechanic nodded, tears running silently down his cheeks. He had learned what no textbook or manual could teach: respect is not given lightly. It is earned through patience, courage, survival, and enduring hardship without losing dignity. It is carried in silence, reflected in action, and felt deeply in the heart. Henry climbed into the driver's seat one final time, started the engine, and let it purr steadily. The Willys had lived through war, through loss, through doubt, and now, through recognition. Its story was complete, yet ongoing. It carried its past with pride, its memories alive in metal, leather, and the hands that had guided it. The young mechanic stepped back, watching the Jeep, feeling a mixture of anger, sorrow, happiness, and all converge in his chest. He understood now that some battles are fought silently, some victories are invisible, and some legacies endure quietly, shaping hearts and minds without spectacle. Henry drove the Willys slowly out of the garage, leaving behind the dust, the tools, and the echoes of history. He didn't hurry, because this journey was not about speed. It was about recognition, respect, and carrying forward the lessons of the past. And behind him, the young mechanic watched, transformed. He had been humbled, educated, and inspired. He understood that strength does not roar, it endures. That courage is not always visible, it persists, and that true respect is not demanded, it is earned. The garage returned to its usual quiet, yet something had shifted. The echo of endurance lingered. The hum of history resonated in the air. And the lesson, carried by Henry the Willys, and the quiet dignity of survival, remained indelible, unforgettable, and eternal. Henry drove on, the Willys alive beneath him, a silent warrior with scars that told stories of sorrow and joy, loss and resilience. The young mechanic would never forget. And neither would anyone who witnessed the power of quiet strength, the weight of human emotion, and the beauty of lessons carried in silence. Because some stories are not about noise. They are about survival. They are about memory. They are about respect. And they are about the quiet heroes who endure unseen until the world finally catches up.